Hello, everyone, and welcome to Interacting with Canadian History. Last time we talked about the 1930s in general and how they were caused and what general life was like during the 1930s. And today we're going to specifically look at minorities in the 1930s. And I think that this is an important topic because often we tend to look at the overall picture, and that tends to ignore um, a lot of people who were experiencing a lot of things during those time periods. So this won't be a 100% this is exactly what's happening to every single minority group in the 1930s, because that would be a much longer video. But I will go into some detail about certain groups like Jewish people, Ukrainian people, and Chinese people during the 1930s. All right, let's get started. So, for our learning goals today, first we're going to understand the historical significance of the Christie Pitts riots. Don't worry if you don't know what that is. We'll figure it out together. All right, next we're going to understand the historical perspective of anti-Semitism and other racism in the 1930s. So we're going to touch on a lot of topics that are, for very good reason, important to a lot of people, and a lot of people have very strong opinions on these topics. We're going to try to check our opinions at the door, because we're trying to understand the perspective of people from the past. Think about these people as like they're from a different planet. They do not share our values necessarily. They might, but we don't have to judge them by our values. We're just learning about their values and why they have them. Okay? Let's get started on that. Okay. So the Christie Pitts riots. In order to understand the Christie Pitts riots, first we have to understand the rise of Nazism and blatant, open anti-Semitism in all of Germany. Most of Germany. The big city centers, at least. This is the time period, 1930s, when Nazism is coming to a fore. Adolf Hitler is becoming a leader of the Nazi Party. They're starting to get elected into political offices, and people are really into this political view of Nazism and this social view of anti-Semitism. And so, with this in mind, we're going to read an article titled Christie Pitts. It's not in your Google Classroom. It is in the video description. Okay? So I want you to take a second, pause this video, read about that, and be prepared to think about the significance of this event. Okay? I'm going to pause now and let you do that. Okay, great. So, let's first think about why the Ukrainians and the Italians present at the game helped the Jewish people during the riot. Think about I want you to put your answers in the comment section down below, and maybe we can get a discussion started about that. I will be sure to respond to as many comments as I can. Now, in response to the Christie Pitts riots, the mayor banned the use of a swastika in Toronto. This is significant. This is significant because it leads us into this idea of whiteness. Now, today, what does it mean to be white? It means to look Caucasian, right? But it wasn't always that way. people like the Italians, like the Ukrainians, like the Jewish people, they weren't considered white. If someone walked up to you in the 1930s and you were one of uh, these three denominations, they wouldn't consider you the same as them if they were from England or Scotland or Ireland or French or German. They were separate, even though they looked similar enough. And it had to do with this idea of racial hierarchy, which the Nazis really expanded upon. So this is what we have to consider going in to the 1930s, that there are certain people, even though they fall under the same brand Caucasian, right, who were considered below certain other Caucasian groups, like I said, the French, the Germans, the English. And of course, even below them at the time was people, African American, Chinese, and other Asian Americans. We're going to talk about the Chinese and other Asian Americans a little bit more later. But this idea of whiteness is something that I want to get across because it's not something that we really experience today. And now in a national context, the Jeune Canada in Montreal. I apologize for the terrible French accent, but basically it was a political group that gained steam in the 1930s, and they held an anti-Jewish boycott. Basically, they vowed not to shop at any Jewish stores. Jews were also seen as communist sympathizers. Why was this a bad thing? Because America was heavily capitalist, and Canada as well at this time. Communists were seen as bad because they were the Russians and the Ukrainians were communists, right? And they were lesser. Just like the Jews and the Italians. Okay? And so lumping them in with this gave them another reason to hate them, a more socially acceptable, valid reason to hate them. And even in cities like Winnipeg, there were Nazi-like marches that were supportive of the Nazi regime in Germany, and also the Nazi Party in Canada. It is important to understand that these views were not just of a few people. They were not very common, but they were common at the time. Not just in Germany, but also in Canada. So the Ku Klux Klan in Canada, everybody has probably heard of this organization. If you haven't, they're an anti-Semitic, basically a white power group. And again, white at the time meant something different than it does today. There were about 125 cells of the Klan in Canadian provinces during the early 1930s. At this time, the hate propaganda was directed at French Canadian settlers and at East European immigrants who were arriving in Saskatchewan. So they didn't like Ukrainians. They didn't like the French, in Ontario anyways. They didn't like immigrants, basically. And sorry to go back, this makes a lot of sense to the people at the time because of what's going on economically. ponder that for a second, we're going to move on a little bit and we'll come back to why this hatred was gaining so much popularity during the 1930s. Okay, so I told you we're going to talk a bit about certain Asian Canadian groups. Chinese Canadians are what we're going to focus on right now. So by the 1930s, the Chinese Canadians make up a significant portion of the population. Why is this? Because Chinese Canadians were basically imported from China to build the Canadian Pacific Railroad, the CPR, about 50 years ago. Okay? And so there were tens of thousands of them coming in to build this. A lot of them died building the railroad, but there was still a large amount left afterwards, and they decided that they wanted to build their life here. So, from 1923 to 1947, the Chinese were excluded altogether from immigrating to Canada. At the turn of the 20th century, so this is the 1900s, there were about 17,000 Chinese settlers in Canada. How are they excluded? The head tax. The head tax basically came into effect right after the Canadian Pacific Railway was finished, and it basically forced Chinese people to pay an amount of money. The amount continued to rise throughout the 20th century, but it started at around $50, which doesn't seem like a lot now, but that take into consideration that Chinese workers were paid about $1 a day. Okay, so they had to pay 50 times their daily wage just to get into Canada. They didn't get that money back. That didn't account for their travel to costs. That dollar also that they get per day is has to pay also for their food, their lodging, their tools, everything that they needed to survive. So, immigration law in the 1930s was also very different from today. So let's think about it in a historical context, in the context of this anti-Semitic racism that was rampant in the 1930s. Okay? So, total deportation was in massive. Between 1930 and 37, 25,000 immigrants were deported. The average rate was about 6 times higher than previous normal. Let's think about why. The Great Depression. That should be a little bit of a hint. Can you think of how the Great Depression might have led Canada to a harsh immigration policy? Take a minute, pause the video. I'll be back. Alright, so we're back. Think about the Great Depression. When we talked about the last video, we said that less than 1 in 10 people, or sorry, the unemployment was at about 11 to 12% in 1933, and it was only rising before that, and so we didn't know when it was going to stop. There was no way they could know when it was going to stop. So 1 in 10 people couldn't find a job, more than 1 in 10, right? This is a very, very common response when we've seen historically. People start to blame someone for them not being able to find a job, right? It can't be their fault, because that's too damning to their self-worth at this time. So, someone needed to be to blame, and the government chose immigrants as their scapegoat. Very easy scapegoat, because they rarely have the ability to defend themselves. Just like now. Just like in this scenario. So, overall, Christy Pitts shows us the amount of anti-Semitism that existed, not just in Germany, but in Canada in the 1930s. Just a random baseball field in Toronto. this level of anti-Semitism happened. The rise of the KKK in Saskatchewan also shows the amount of racism in Canada towards other groups, like African Canadians and Chinese Canadians, Asian Canadians, non-white. Again, white meant something different than it did now. The head tax and other immigration laws in the 1930s show how the Great Depression contributed to racism as well at the time. So now we have a bit of a better understanding of what minorities were going through, certain minority groups were going through during the 1930s. If you want to learn more about the head tax, I'm going to be doing a video on it soon. Stay tuned for that. Thank you all for sticking it out to the end of the video. Thank you for interacting with Canadian history with me, and I'll see you next time.